Kia ora, welcome to episode 96 of Talking Dairy. In today's episode, we're talking about dry-off, which I'm sure a lot of listeners appreciate is a pretty crucial time in the season because the way it's managed affects everything from udder health to production next season. So with a shift towards more selective dry cow therapy, how do we make sure our cows are well protected from mastitis while using antibiotics responsibly? We've got a couple of experienced guests with us today who will share the latest insights from research and break down the advice for us. Plus, they've got some great tips and tricks for how to make the process run smoothly and set your herd up for success next season. I'm your host, Jack McGowan, and a senior developer here at DairyNZ. Joining me today is Mitch Cooper from Taranaki, who's a veterinarian and in his official capacity at DairyNZ is a senior technical and policy advisor, and Veronica Oostveen from Invercargill, who is both DairyNZ's Southland Area Manager and a dairy farmer, contract milking 1,000 cows and share milking 650 cows in Raisbush, Southland. Tēnā korua, welcome to you both. Veronica, let's start with you. As an area manager for Southland and a dairy farmer yourself, can you tell us a bit about your role and what you do?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jack. I originally moved here to New Zealand in 2010 to study abroad at the University of Otago. I met my now husband, Patrick, and I pivoted from a fast-track role in public relations to contract milking in Raisbush. I have had numerous roles off-farm and on-farm, managing farms, converting farms, multi-farm operations. And then in October, I took the role at DairyNZ. It's been here about 6 months, and I really do love the role. I think I have a unique perspective being an active farmer that I can understand the industry, the region, the challenges and the opportunities we have as a farming community down here. And what I love most about my job is being able to facilitate farmer-to-farmer interactions and connecting people and providing solutions, resources, and tools.
Thanks, Veronica. You're running a couple of farms. What kind of systems do you have in place? And since we're here to talk about dry-off, how has your dry-off process evolved over time?
Yeah, so there's a few farms there, but I think for simplicity for today, it's probably easy if I just stick to the 1,000 cow farm, because obviously anyone who has any experience with running multi-farms knows that each farm is a little bit different to the other. The history is different, the cows are different, the dry-off schedule is a little bit different. So the 1,000 cow farm, we've been contract milking since 2011. So we have a lot of history there. The systems have evolved massively. We're quite competitive with ourselves where we think every year we can do better than the year before, like I'm sure a lot of farmers are. Now we're kind of landed on a system 4-5 high input farm. We use wearables technology. We record in MINDA. We do herd tests 4 times a year. We also have complete control over the cows as far as wintering goes. So we winter on the platform, and then young stock is grazed away. Because of that recording, we started seeing some trends in mastitis in the heifers and the R2s. So we decided to start teat sealing only the R2s before their first calving.
So they were calving down with mastitis?
Mastitis was coming in the Springer herd, like through the spring and mainly in the front part of the season, a little bit in the middle and the end, but we just thought the amount of mastitis, that was about 10% of our first lactation cows. It was quite high. So we sat down with the vet, did a big consult with her, and decided to just do teat seal only in the heifers. The vets come out and do that. We don't do it ourselves. They go to a runoff. The young stock are grazed away, and they're done out there, and then they come home in the end of July. We saw a really big response to that. So our amount of clinical cases from that group rapidly dropped down. Now we're kind of going more towards doing it into some of the mixed-staged cows, but our criteria is quite narrow for that at the moment. So we're only doing our first and second lactation cows. We are keeping it under 125 cell count. They can never have had mastitis, and they also have to be doing less than 15 liters a day off their last herd test, which we do around the second week of May. And they have to have really good teat ends, but the vets are the ones making that call because they're the ones that are doing those cows.
So prior to starting to do teat seal in some of your first and second lactation cows, you were putting dry cow antibiotics?
Everything was blanket dry cow. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Long acting blanket dry cow. Yeah. We did that since 2011. Yeah. And then our first season was 22, 23, that was the first year that we did the selective and the combo.
Okay.
And now everything that doesn't get teat seal, that selective teat seal, gets a combo teat seal dry cow.
Okay. And so what prompted you to make the change to selective dry cow therapy for your cows?
Our farm had a couple years of just having 130 cell count. We held that for a long time. We came down from quite a high cell count, and we held that for about 3 or 4 years, not able to shift it through management. So we saw in that first year that big shift down, and that's what probably got us really excited about it, that we were able to drop our average cell count. For us, if we have a lower cell count herd and a lower cell count cow, that offers us more culling space in our herd. So for us, repro and mastitis and clinicals are actually quite related, because from that MINDA information, we saw that from the clinical cases in our last season's results, in our clinical cases group, 36% was our 6-week result, and our empty result was 38% in that group of cows. So that's quite high for a group of cows to be, when our averages are actually quite different from that. So our average this year, our 6-week was 78 and our empty was 11. So it's quite a big gap when you think about it, as that could be 20% of the herd in that group or 15% of the herd in that group.
So you could see that mastitis was potentially having a big impact on the in-calf rate in those cows. And so addressing that gives you more choice around what you cull.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's hard to look at some of these topics as a single silo of information, right? Because the farming system is, everything is related to everything. And that's probably our mantra on farm, maybe, or every farmer's mantra on farm is, you can't pull one string without the rest of everything else falling in on top of it. So little decisions and little 1%ers that you can gain anywhere can result in huge uplifts on major KPIs across the board.
So that's quite a big shift in the way you approach your dry cow therapy from blanket to selective. What kind of results have you seen so far?
Before the 22-23 season, like I said, we were sitting on that 130 average for quite a while. We've been able to, the 22-23 season, go down to 119,000 cell count average. And then last season, we got down to 98,000 cell count average. So pretty good results there. Of course, this season, really rough in Southland. Everyone knows that Southland had it tough. North Island's having it tough now. It's just the swings about that it goes in. So we're back up to 118. But in talking to our vets, that's actually still relatively low for what the district's doing in terms of averages for the season.
So Veronica, you talked about the benefits for cell count and in-calf rate. What other benefits have you seen, if any, outside of those?
Well, I guess because we have complete control over our wintering, we decide when they get dried off and when they go on the crop paddocks. I don't need to organize grazers and truck companies on that farm. We can dry them off in batches. So it's nice to have the vets come in and we're doing 250 this year. It's nice to have them come in and do the 250 that are on farm. And then we just worry about the other 700 or 800 that we have to do. And we can do them in 2 or 3 batches over a week. So that's quite nice. Takes a little bit of pressure off the team as well to take away just that 250. It seems to really, when you're comboing 800 cows or 750 cows, it's a long day. It's very hard on the body. So yeah, we want to make sure we're protecting them that last week, because obviously with wintering on, you can imagine our first week of June is quite busy.
So your approach to dry off has evolved over time, and you're now using fewer antibiotics while still keeping mastitis under control. And that's a big shift that we're seeing across the industry. Mitch, why is reducing antibiotic use important? What do farmers need to know about antimicrobial resistance?
I guess as a start point, we'll just quickly talk about what antimicrobial resistance is and what that looks like worldwide. So antimicrobial resistance worldwide is a sort of progressive reduction in the ability for antibiotics to treat bacterial infections, particularly common bacterial infections. And the reality is we're through the great revolution of creating antibiotics in the world. So we can't just keep creating new ones to deal with the problem. So we're stuck largely in a world where we need to make sure the ones that we currently have available to us continue working for as long as we possibly can. And so we've sort of seen a progressive increasing issue in both human health and animal health around the world, and those two tie in together a little bit. There is a degree of crossover between how antimicrobial resistance happens in the human population and how it happens in the animal population. So it's sort of up to everyone to play a role to improve it. Good news from a New Zealand farming point of view is that we're relatively low antibiotic users in the grand scheme of things. But out of the antibiotics that dairy cattle farmers use, a huge portion of them are for mastitis. And of that portion, a really big portion of that is dry cow therapy. So there's always room for improvement. With an increasing focus on AMR worldwide, we're seeing a lot more pressure come on from governments and overseas markets to reduce usage in both people and animals. And what that means for us as a New Zealand industry is that if we want to continue selling our milk to whoever we'd like for the premiums we'd like, we need to make sure our usage is responsible and sort of decreasing in lines with the expectation that the world has. There have been quite significant shifts in world agreements in recent history to attempt to consistently reduce antibiotic usage between now and 2030 and onwards. We are seeing a little bit of resistance creeping through to common mastitis bacteria for some of the dry cow antibiotics that we currently use. So we're already seeing it in a New Zealand context, not at huge levels, and it is worse on farms that have been using dry cow therapy, particularly the same dry cow therapies for year on year on year on year at a blanket herd level. And so it is, I guess, slowly creeping into our day-to-day, and it's something that if we are not careful of, it can sort of slide out of control. The biggest concern at the moment we certainly have is cow to cow, and so the bacterial population in our cows is a risk, but there's also an increased concern of cow to human transmission and vice versa. And we have in the last couple of years seen a few cases of methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, MRSA, which is a particularly nasty, very resistant bacteria popping up in a few herds around the country. The speculation is that that's been transferred from humans to cows in this instance, but there is a risk that that spreads through the cow population and can then come back to humans and is a very challenging bacteria to treat.
I'm sure all of us have heard about that. So you mentioned that there is some antimicrobial resistance popping up. Is it in specific strains of bacteria? So is it more in the Staph aureus, or is it also the environmental, like the Strep uberis?
Yeah, we see it a little in a couple of species. Strep uberis and Staph aureus are certainly two of the major ones that we keep an eye on because they're good reflections. Strep uberis is a good reflection of the most common environmental mastitis pathogen we see, and Staph aureus is one of the more concerning contagious mastitis pathogens. And we do see on some farms a slight increased resistance in both of those bacteria to common antibiotics used. More and more over the last sort of 5 or 10 years, farms have been able to do what's called a dairy antibiogram, which gives a good understanding of at your herd level what your resistance might look like to some of the common antibiotics we have available to us. And although I don't think we have really, really good sort of published data to say it's rampantly increasing, I think we are starting to see more and more cases pop up here and there. And certainly in clinical practice, I've seen enough farms have some degree of resistance to these antibiotics to say, hey, we're not going to get to use these forever.
I'm hearing there an expectation that we use antibiotics responsibly as farmers, but it's also for our own benefit too, ensuring that tool becomes useful. There seems some similarity to, having to use worm treatments, more judiciously as well to avoid resistance there. So, Mitch, how has dry cow antibiotic usage changed over time in New Zealand?
The data we've had collected in both published studies and the data that DairyNZ collects on a yearly basis indicates that overall blanket dry cow usage has come down. And certainly the numbers we've got from 2017 to now indicate that we started at a level of about 70 or 80% of herds, at least in DairyNZ statistics, using blanket dry cow therapy. And that number has come down to somewhere around 40 or 50% of herds, but it has stalled a little bit. We have made some good progress, and part of that progress we've also seen is the increased use of teat sealants, both in cows and heifers. And since 2017, we have seen quite a significant increase in the usage of teat sealant in heifers, up from about sort of 40% to 70 or 80% now. We are seeing progress, but we have also hit a point that we have probably stalled a little bit in the industry. And so now I guess is a good opportunity to say, right, well, we've got the early adopters and the low-hanging fruit under control. Where to next?
Yes, so 60% of farmers are already using selective dry cow therapy. What do you think is holding the other 40% back?
There's a combination of a lot of things. I think a lot of farmers are understandably risk averse about switching to selective dry cow. The perceived risk is that switching to a selective dry cow therapy program ends up in much worse mastitis and much worse cell counts in following seasons. The great news to that is that we've just done a large-scale piece of research that has informed our updated tech notes and guidelines for dry-off that indicates that that's not really the case. We don't see a drastic shift in cell count. We don't see a slip over seasons with continued seasons of selective dry cow. And I think Veronica's story is a great example of that in action, in that you've seen an improvement to start off with and no drastic slip since you've started doing it. So apart from the risk-averse nature, I guess there is the challenge of actually drying off the cows. It's a difficult process, particularly when you're using selective dry cow therapy and when you're not putting antibiotics into certain cows. You have to do it really, really well, I would argue perfectly, to ensure that process doesn't result in post-dry-off mastitis. And there's certainly a population of farmers out there where either it's a facilities issue or a staffing issue or simply a cost issue, where it has been quite a significant barrier to getting that process done to the standard they would like to take the risk out of the equation and make sure that, yes, we can use selective dry cow, but we're not going to have issues as a result of that.
All right, Mitch, so obviously there's some risks to consider. How should farmers decide on the right dry-off protocol for their herd?
So as I mentioned earlier, we've got Tech Note 14 and Guidelines 14, which are the Smart SAM guidelines for making dry-off decisions. And those have been recently updated as of February 2025 with new data that we've had available to us to, I think, strengthen the quality of our recommendations even further. Nothing's drastically changed, but we have just strengthened our position to say, hey, look, here are the things that we see when you use selective versus blanket dry cow, and here are sort of some of the appropriate cut-offs. What we have seen is a slight shift from originally it was a herd level decision. You'd look at a herd and you'd say, okay, based on bulk somatic cell count, individual cow somatic cell count from herd testing, clinical data, potential other on-farm diagnostic tools and things like RNTing at the time of dry-off, we could sort of use all of these data points to make a herd level decision and say, okay, this herd should have selective dry cow and this herd should have blanket dry cow. That's flipping on its head a little bit. And I think the general consensus now and the way the tech note reads and the way the guidelines recommend is that we sort of start at an individual cow level and say, we assume all herds are selective dry cow until proven otherwise. And there are quite stringent criteria to apply to say that this herd is appropriate for blanket dry cow, and that's a relatively small population of farms in New Zealand. So what we really want to see when we're making those dry cow decisions is first and foremost, you're having that discussion with your vet, and your vet is the one prescribing those drugs. What your vet would really love to see is as much data as possible. That's not always possible and that's not always practical, but in the perfect world, we'd love a full season's worth of bulk milk somatic cell count, including previous seasons' graphs is quite handy to sort of understand trends and where things go through the season and how things are tracking, particularly at the end of the season. We love herd test records. A single herd test within 80 days of dry off is a really useful data point for making selective dry cow decisions. Or alternatively, rapid mastitis testing at the time of dry off is a reasonable equivalent. Clinical case records are really, really useful to have. We can use some of the on-farm mastitis diagnostics that we've seen pop up in the last 5 or 10 years, and they shouldn't be the top level of decision making. We should be using them in conjunction with all the other data we have available to us.
Veronica, Mitch talked about the challenges of doing selective dry cow therapy well. How do you make sure dry off goes as smoothly as possible and manage those risks?
So I guess all of our risks are managed through our vets because we don't teat seal only our cows. None of us do it. It's not that we couldn't. I'm sure we have extremely skilled people in our team, but it's just I don't want the weight of it, so I'm not going to give it to the people in my team either because, I've heard what can happen if things go wrong. So we're just trying to do a preventative measure, I guess, by having the vets come in and just eliminating the risk almost entirely, I guess. There's always human error, but our vets are pretty good. So we haven't ever had an issue with it. We also are still doing quite a lot of milk production in early May. So because of our system, they're still doing 1.5 to 1.8 per cow, we really need to try and wind them down to dry off because as people know in Southland, milking into June is not really an option. We do not have concrete and roofs on our farms, unfortunately. We need to wind them down. So we do that with whole crop silage. We start that at the end of April, and then we really wind that up about a week before we dry them off. And they're on about a 50-50 of whole crop silage and pasture mix. And then they're also still getting supplements through the shed as well. We also, I think doing them in groups really helps because you're quite fresh when you get to that group of cows to do that 200 that day. Because the way we used to do it, where it was all of them got done in one morning, by kind of 8:30, you're getting quite tired and seeing the same thing over and over again. You're not being as diligent with doing it. So I think that we've had great results by doing that. We don't put them straight on the crop when they're coming off the shed. That's probably a change that we've done many, many years ago. Now they go back to a recently grazed paddock that's kind of been maybe 7 days old. They get a lot of whole crop silage, baleage. They get that for the whole morning, and then we put them onto the crop paddocks from midday. They're also drafted out into their body condition score groups straight away out of the shed. So we have about 7 to 9 groups of cows on the farm, on that 1,000 cow farm. And straight away, they're drafted into their groups that they're going to go in. So it's quite easy to move them that one day, move them from the grass paddock to whichever crop paddock they're going to go to. So for now, it's going pretty seamlessly. But to be honest, Jack, every single year we change it and we critique it and we try and make it a little bit better and a little bit easier. So this year, who knows what's going to happen? It just kind of depends on the weather. It's always weather dependent in Southland. If it snows or it's frozen or the shed's frozen or there's a foot of snow like we've had in the past on dry off days, that definitely makes us think on our feet and change our entire plan. So I can't actually speak to that's the plan that we're going to follow.
I suppose your practice of doing them in groups is a little bit like investing. It spreads your risk a little bit.
It does. And they're also done in the groups that we're drying off in. They're also kind of in age groups as well, because on our farm, our cows are in 2 herds. They're in a first, second, third, little bit of light mixed age cows herd, and then they're in a bigger, older, more heavy producing herd. So if we get kind of those ones out of the way, and the vets have done half of those, we really do focus our attention on our big producing herd. And that's actually our higher risk herd. So in our data from our clinical cases, our risk group is the biggest producers on our farm. So if we can really pay attention to those and do those well, it would hopefully result in spring being a lot less cases next year. So that's what we're going with now.
Thank you. Mitch, as you said, you've helped plenty of farmers with dry-offs too. What are your hot tips for making it go well?
I wanted to touch on something that Veronica said because it's really, really important, is the management of the nutrition of the cows prior to dry-off is one of the biggest things that we can get right. Studies that DairyNZ did a decade or so ago now indicate that it is the sort of biggest tool we have available to us to really wind down milk production, and making sure that we wind that milk production right down so that they're not still producing 15 litres on the day of dry off really make sure that that process can go well. So it's not just about the day of dry off, it's about the weeks and sort of months beforehand as far as milking frequency and nutrition. But when it comes to the day of dry off, the big things that we would see in clinical practice was normally lots of people makes a big, big difference. And as long as, I guess, they are the right people in the right parts of the job to make sure it goes smoothly, not everyone's going to get their vet's involved, and that's fine. We've seen lots of good success stories where neighbours or farm groups will get together and they'll go and dry off one person's farm, and they'll dry off the next person's farm the next day. And as long as everyone involved in that process is meticulously clean and is sure about the process and sort of understands the risks involved. And we're not just talking selective dry cow, we're talking blanket dry cow herds or cows receiving antibiotic dry cow therapy as well. You need to be really, really clean, and you need to make sure that everything goes smoothly and consistently. Sometimes people do get vets involved, and normally a lot of vet clinics have quite large technician teams in the modern world that will go out and do some of these dry off jobs just to make it sort of flow better. You can get through large numbers, you can do the job perhaps a lot quicker than your on-farm team would otherwise be able to do it. Sometimes we'd have guys just get out one of our technicians or two of our technicians to just give them the hand to lighten the workload, and occasionally to keep an eye on staff, just to make sure that...
Not slipping.
Yeah, just to make sure that everyone's standards in the shed are consistent and make sure everyone's following the same policy. We've certainly heard of and seen plenty of horror stories where people have done it wrong. So cleanliness, hygiene is critical. Facilities, really, really critical as well. You've got to make sure that the facilities are appropriate. There's adequate water available. There's adequate people. You've got an effective teat sprayer working, either a handheld one or your normal machine. You've got to make sure that the pasture or standoff pad or whatever those cows are going on to is sort of fit for purpose.
Clean.
Yeah, clean, dry, which is obviously a challenge in certain years and in certain parts of the country, but it's about sort of, I guess, picking the best options you have available. The more things you can do as well as you can, the less risk we see time and time again. And certainly in the Waikato, where the vast majority of my client base was through clinical practice, we would see no more than a couple of farms a year have dry-off issues total. And most years we wouldn't have a single farm with dry-off issues. And I think a lot of people are really, really in tune with how they do their dry-off procedures these days.
To carry on what Mitch just said, because we're in a 3-farm farming group, we help each other out. So we would have 8 to 9 people in the shed for dry off, even for the small batches of cows, because everyone helps everyone out. But that was even before we were in a group of 3 farms. We still had neighbors that we would go to and help out. We've always dried off with neighbors. We've always helped each other out. And something else, like Mitch just talked about, being prepared and having people that know how to do the job. Our vets come out and do training with people every year, and they do a how to administer dry cow training, even on our most, senior people on farm. My husband's there. So it's a good refresher as well. And it also carries over to the rest of the season when they're also doing, other anti-microbial treatments. So it's not just dry cow related.
Excellent. Before we wrap up, are there any further changes to what you're doing now that you're thinking of making, Veronica? You've said it depends on how the season plays out, but what's on your mind?
So our newer farm, that farm doesn't have clinical cases attached to MINDA, and it was quite interesting because both farms are with the same vets. So the conversation we had with the farm with all the historical data was quite different to the conversation we had with the farm that didn't have as much data. So our change there is that we're going to put some tech into the shed. We're going to be able to record clinicals to MINDA as they happen. So that way, next season, when we're making the criteria selections, we have better selection. And when we have our cull cow decisions, we have better data around that. We still do have a challenge on farm with the amount of clinical cases we have. Like, obviously, I've spoken to that from our repro groups. So we are working with vets to really try and pinpoint what's happening there. Of course, it's a multifaceted issue. Like, that's probably its own podcast. But yeah, the point is that we're working with the experts to really focus on that group of cows.
Thank you. Thank you both. Finally, where can farmers go for more information? You've mentioned Tech Note 14, Mitch. Where's that?
Yeah, so the DairyNZ website has tons of great resources. The Smart SAM Tech Notes and Guidelines are the sort of core reference material for mastitis management and dry-off management for the industry. And as I said, Tech Note 14 is the technical information behind Guideline 14. And so Guideline 14 is more of a farmer-facing material, and TechNote 14 is more of probably a veterinary or rural professional-facing material. And those are both available on the DairyNZ website, and they have just been updated as of February 2025.
Farmers can find those at dairynz.co.nz/dry-off. Okay, so bringing it all together, drying off isn't just about what happens on the day. As both Mitch and Veronica said, it's about setting your cows up for a healthy, productive next season, and getting it right starts with making good, informed decisions and using the data you have. We've heard from Veronica about how selective dry cow therapy has helped improve their herd's health, and from Mitch about why responsible antibiotic use matters for the future. The research backs it up. When done well, selective dry cow therapy works just as effectively as blanket treatment, helping to protect milk quality and reduce antibiotic use. So what's important to remember? Use your herd data. Somatic cell count history, mastitis records and herd test results should guide your decisions. Get the basics right. A smooth dry-off comes down to good planning, so things like nutrition, paddock selection, hygiene and staff training all play a big part. Work with your vet, have the conversations with them early, order what you need in advance and make a plan that works for your farm. And thinking big picture, mastitis management isn't just about dry-off, it's a season-long approach. New Zealand's dairy industry is leading the way in responsible antibiotic use, but as Mitch said, there's always room for improvement. By making smart choices now, we're protecting our future. For more information, check out the updated guidelines for farmers and the Smart SAM resources and tech notes for rural professionals on our website at dairynz.co.nz/dry-off. Ngā mihi nui to Veronica and Mitch for joining us today. Thanks for tuning into this episode of Talking Dairy. Make sure to hit follow so you can keep up to date with our latest episodes. You can also keep up with DairyNZ News on Facebook, Instagram and LinkedIn, or go to our website and sign up for our fortnightly DairyNZ News emails. As always, if you have any feedback on this podcast or have some ideas for future topics or guests to have on the show, please email us at talkingdairy@dairynz.co.nz. Mā te wā, Mōri ora, catch you next time.